Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Saturday of fourth week here at the Oxford Union and the second event in our very exciting Smashing the Silos series. The first speaker I'd like to ask to speak is Professor David Levine. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, well, I'm coming to you live from Florence, Italy, where I'm a professor at the European University Institute, and I'm going to ask whether or not we need patents. And I'm going to talk about work that I've done with my co-author, Michele Baldrini, on patents, and discuss it also in the context of some recent events that we're probably all too familiar with. So I'm just going to start with a bit of background and say what patents are. Patents, simply put, are government-enforced monopolies over ideas. Copyright is a little bit different. Copyright protects specific content, but patents, by contrast, protect the underlying ideas, not the specific details of how things work. So I'll give you a little example. For example, it's now possible to patent doing something with a computer that was previously done without a computer. And a famous example of this is what's called the Amazon one-click patent. An Amazon one-click patent patents the idea of pressing a single button to pay over the internet. So that's an idea. There's a lot of different ways of implementing that idea, but that is protected, or it was protected. It was rather controversial at the time. Now, why do I say that this is patenting doing something with a computer that was previously done without a computer? Probably you've all used soft drink machines, and you're aware that you push a button and you get your soft drink, right? So the idea of the Coca-Cola machine was repatented in the form of doing Coca-Cola machines over the internet. So there's an example of a patent where the underlying idea is protected, and maybe also you get the idea that patents are not my favorite things. So let me first tell you what the case for patents is, and then I'll tell you what the case against patents is. The case for patents is actually pretty simple. The case for patents says that, without patents, inventors would have no way to profit off of their ideas. Okay, so as a result, we would have very few ideas produced. There would be little innovation because innovators are in a position, you come up with a great idea, you produce some product, everybody sees it, they see it's a great product, you spend all this time and cost of money developing your product, putting it to market. It's a success, everybody sees it's a success, and boom, they say, aha, we're going to imitate it, we're going to do it too, and now suddenly, where's the profit in it, right? You have to compete with all these other people using your idea, okay? And so this is the argument. The argument is that we need to give, at least for a limited amount of time, a patent, a monopoly over the idea so that the inventor has time to profit from it before other people jump into the market and take the profit away. That's the idea. That's the argument for patents. I think we're all somewhat familiar with this because it's repeated very often. And indeed, it sounds pretty compelling, a fact which I'll come back to at the very end when I get done. Okay, so now having said that, why do I think patents are a bad idea? So there's actually a basic point that's missing. There's an idea here that ideas are costly to develop. But the fact is that ideas are cheap. It's easy to have ideas. It's easy to have good ideas. What's difficult is to implement ideas, to actually do something useful with your idea. And so as a result of this, it turns out that there's a lot of ways to profit from innovation which don't involve patents at all. And I'll give some examples of this as we go forward. The other element of this is patents, monopoly is harmful. All economists understand this. I think most people understand this. Monopoly is harmful to consumers. You pay a higher price to get these goods. Fewer goods are available. But maybe what's less apparent is that monopoly is harmful to innovation itself. So why are patents harmful to innovation? The reason is this. Virtually all ideas build on previous ideas. All innovation builds on previous innovations. So when you come up with an idea or an innovation or develop a new product, okay, incorporated in that product are a lot of existing ideas from existing products. If those are patented, then you need to license the patent. So you build a complicated machine. Inside that machine are all these different pieces. Some of those different pieces you didn't invent. You've got to pay the inventors of all those different machines. So the other side of patents is it makes innovation much more costly. Okay. So I actually have a quote on this from a guy. I'll tell you the quote first, and I'll tell you who said it. It's about software patents. Patenting of computer software, such as the Amazon Click would be an example. And the quote says this. It says, if people had understood how patents would be granted when most of today's ideas were invented, so this is around 2000-ish, if people had understood how patents would be granted when most of today's ideas were invented and had taken out patents on all these basic software ideas, the industry would be at a complete standstill today. Why? Because you couldn't build an operating system because you have to pay the inventor of the do loop. You'd have to pay the inventor of the hashing. I mean, there's millions of ideas, without exaggeration, to go into a computer program, right? And if all those ideas were patented, you'd have to pay every patent holder for every one of those ideas. Now, who said this? Who is this a quote from? Not from me. That's a quote from Bill Gates, okay? So somebody who's heavily involved in the software industry, heavily involved in innovation in the software industry, saying basically there would be no industry if at the time the industry started to really develop, which was over a 30 or 40 year period, if at that time there were patents as they were introduced in the year 2000, there would be no industry. That's not me speaking, that's Bill Gates speaking, okay? So there, in a nutshell, is the argument that patents inhibit innovation as opposed to encourage innovation. Okay, I want to give you a second quote. This is from 2014. This is a small obscure company at that time made a big announcement on their blog. And I'm going to read you the entire quote. The only thing I've done is to remove the name of the industry and the name of the company, which I'll tell you at the end. The title of the post is, "All our patents belong to you." And this is what it says. It says, "Yesterday, there was a wall of patents in the lobby of our headquarters. That is no longer the case. They have been removed in the spirit of open source movement for the advancement of technology." So they didn't literally get rid of their patents. Technically, what they did was to give a free license to their patents. Anybody could use their patents freely under a license, but without having to pay them any royalties. Now, this is the rationale in that post. "I thought that patents were a good thing and worked hard to obtain them. And maybe they were good long ago. But too often these days, they serve merely to stifle progress, entrench the positions of giant corporations, and enrich those in the legal profession rather than the actual inventors." So pretty much the opposite of the case for patents. This is the case against patents. I'm going to continue with the quote, "We felt compelled to create patents out of concern that the big companies would copy our technology and then use their massive manufacturing, sales, and marketing power to overwhelm us." That's the argument for patents. Okay, to finish the quote, "We couldn't have been more wrong." Okay, so this is an actual quotation from a real company, and maybe this was a colossal mistake on their part. So let's ask, how did it work out for them? They got rid of their patents, and how did they do? So what was the name of the company? The company was Tesla Motors. The person that the quote is from is Elon Musk. Elon Musk, you may realize now, is competing with Jeff Bezos for the title of the richest person in the world. So, seems to have worked out pretty well for these guys, would be the short. Sorry, I have a little bit of a minor glitch here, but it's fixed now. Okay, very good. So again, this isn't me speaking, that's Elon Musk speaking. So it seemed to have worked out pretty well for him. He owns the most profitable and most valuable motor company in the world, Tesla Motors, and it was built on a foundation of open patents, not closed patents, okay? All right, I'm going to pause on that because I'm going to change gears, okay? I talked about software patents. I've talked about automobile patents. What about pharmaceutical patents? So most people think that pharmaceutical patents are different. And indeed, pharmaceutical patents are different. Pharmaceutical patents are much more narrowly targeted than other kinds of patents. What's patented in a pharmaceutical patent is a particular chemical formula or a particular biological entity. It's not some broad click with the mouse, okay? It's a very specific, narrow thing that the patent is tailored to, okay? And now I want to ask what it is that pharmaceutical companies do and how it is that patents play a role in what they do and what the potential problems would be if we were to get rid of patents for pharmaceutical companies. So here's the thing. Most actual drugs are not invented by pharmaceutical companies. They're mostly invented in government-funded university laboratories. And I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later. Okay, what is it then that pharmaceutical companies do? They spend large amounts on research and development, not actually on inventing drugs, but on doing what? And the answer is the research and development cost is mostly spent on testing drugs. And most of that, their stage, we may be familiar now, there's stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 trials. They start with animals and they work their way up to humans, and eventually they have really a lot of people. The stage 3 clinical trials in terms of cost are far and away the most expensive part of developing a new drug and bringing it to market. These are the large scale tests that we've been seeing for COVID vaccines for the last 6 to 8 months. Okay, hundreds of thousands of people are recruited, they're paid, it's very expensive. Okay, so here's the question. Without patents, how could pharmaceutical companies pay for these very expensive clinical trials? So here's sort of the worst case, or maybe the best case for patents, because after all, you go through all these expensive trials, and then and everybody knows what the chemical formula is, or the biological entity, everybody knows the formula, and you go through 6 months, 2 years, some number of years of trials. COVID trials, the vaccine trials were very short in comparison to the usual length of time. You spend a ton of money. At the end, maybe you fail. Okay, that's too bad. You spent your money. It's gone. Maybe you succeed. Voila. Everybody knows you succeeded. The clinical trials are done. And so now, if there's no patent, everybody can use your chemical formula for free. They can go out and sell competition with you, and how are you going to pay for these clinical trials? This is the worst case, right? Very good. You pay for these trials, your competitors all get the information for free. So there's a couple questions that need to be addressed in thinking about this. The first question is whether stage 3 clinical trials are really needed. That is, there are alternative models, and the alternative models involve selling the pharmaceutical profit on an experimental basis, selling the pharmaceutical product on an experimental basis for profit, while at the same time, those who choose to buy it, some subset of them at least, are required to abide by the rules for clinical trials. That is, they have to agree that they might be given an alternative treatment instead in order to determine if the treatment works, which is what's done in stage 3 clinical trials. Okay, and there's actually John Cochrane of the Hoover Institute argued that COVID vaccines would have been ever so much better if we'd done things that way, rather than going through all these clinical trials. So it's an issue about whether clinical trials are even needed. The second issue is whether if there are going to be clinical trials, do we really want the clinical trials to be conducted by the same people that are going to profit off the sale of a pharmaceutical product? Seems like a pretty severe conflict of interest, right? You have sort of an incentive to slant your results so that you can sell the product. And one can have other models. We could have people that specialize in doing clinical trials. And indeed, there are people that specialize in doing clinical trials. And pharmaceutical companies don't actually do clinical trials themselves. They hire specialists in doing clinical trials to do the clinical trials for them. Why don't these specialists compete, for example, for contracts? Maybe what they should do is they should agree that they get a patent, but whoever, the person that should get the patent is the person that agrees to the clinical trials, right, agrees to the lowest licensing fee for the patent. You get to do the clinical trials, and if they're successful, you get the, so there's a lot of other models here. Very good. Okay, so there's a lot of issues as to whether or not these patents are really needed, but there's a deeper issue. And the deeper issue is whether it's really true that because you conducted clinical trials and because everybody knows the chemical formula, that therefore all your competitors can immediately jump into the market and compete with you. And I'm going to argue that that's certainly not true. And I'm going to use as a case study something that perhaps we're all relatively familiar with, which is the COVID-19 vaccine. So I'm going to talk about COVID-19 vaccines. So all COVID-19 vaccines are patented. Okay. And these patents are pretty useless as far as protection from competition goes. Why? Because there are a lot of COVID-19 vaccines. How many? 700 under development. 12 have been launched. That is, people are actually getting shots, jabs, with 12 different vaccines. So nobody here is getting a monopoly from their patents. Okay. So here we've seen one of the most costly pharmaceutical developments of efforts of all time. And everybody knew when they spent all this money that they weren't, despite the patent, going to get a monopoly. Why did they do it? Because the good-heartedness of the pharmaceutical companies. They're just throwing money away because they want to help mankind, right? Now, I don't want to, I'm being a little unfair here because I actually do believe that the people that are involved with this do want to help mankind, okay? But I don't think that's the main reason that they're doing it. So let's talk first about the development cost. How much does it cost to actually invent a COVID-19 vaccine? Okay, well, the co-founder of BioNTech designed the corona vaccine it made with Pfizer, which is one of the leading ones on the market today, in just over a few hours on a single day. Doesn't sound terribly expensive. I don't care what kind of equipment he used or what kind of scientific laboratory he had. One day's worth of work in the most expensive laboratory in the world just doesn't cost that much, not compared to the billions of dollars that are involved in developing a new pharmaceutical product. Now, bear in mind, why is it that the co-founder of BioNTech was able to develop this drug in a couple of hours over a single day? Because of knowledge that had been developed in government-funded academic research over a period of decades. That is, there was a body of knowledge not available to me. I mean, technically available to me, but I wouldn't understand it. Probably you wouldn't understand it either. But to experts in the field, such as the co-founder of BioNTech and other people who are microbiologists and work in this area, there is a body of knowledge that was developed not by pharmaceutical companies, for the most part not under patent, that enables them to do this development at very low cost. So the problem here is not the cost of inventing. When we visualize invention, we see invention as this very costly process. And here's a perfect example of the extent to which that isn't true. Now, the next question I want to ask, and this is the part to me that's most interesting, okay? Did we have excessive stage 3 trials? Was it the stage 3 trials that are the big holdup in getting the vaccine out? Is John Cochrane right? It could have been much better if we just sold the vaccines from the beginning, the day after they were developed. And maybe this whole stage 3 process is just a big drag on the entire thing. Very good. It actually strikes me that that's probably not the case. And let me explain why that is. So most Western countries, even most developing countries, have very similar system of clinical trials, stage 3 trials. So the system in Europe is not that different than the system in the United States. It's not that different than the system in Japan, which quite frankly isn't that much different than the system in India either. Okay, so it's not maybe very surprising that these clinical trials all came to a successful, or in a few cases, very few cases, unsuccessful conclusion at about the same time. Okay, but it strikes me that there are several countries which are actually quite capable of producing vaccines and very capable biomedical researchers, which are not so fastidious. And I would say that neither Russia nor China are as fastidious as the United States and Europe when it comes to the potential downside of vaccine risks. And we know that in Russia, they supposedly finished their stage 3 clinical trials last summer. And they were supposedly vaccinating the whole population last summer. And we know that Vladimir Putin's daughter got vaccinated last summer. Okay. But as far as I can tell, The vast bulk of the Russian population as of today has not yet been vaccinated. And indeed, the widespread inoculation in Russia appears to be starting at about the same time as it is in other countries. Okay, so they might have shortcutted the approval process, but for some reason, there's the same delay. And I could say the same about China, because China supposedly started vaccinating their military with a vaccine last summer, and as far as I know, they did. But as far as we can tell, they're rolling out the vaccine for the rest of the population only now at about the same time as everybody else. So this suggests to me that stage 3 clinical trials are probably not what's involved in the delay. So what could it be then? What's causing this delay? So let's take a look at the European Union. As you probably are aware, those of you who are in the UK, the European Union is pretty far behind the UK in rolling out the vaccine. Why is that? Part of that's because the approval took about a month longer, but that hasn't been the biggest issue. The biggest issue is the vaccine was approved in December and it's still not available basically today. Why is that? Because it takes a long time to build up the production capability of really providing lots and lots of doses of vaccine. That is, it's not true that because I have the chemical formula or the biological formula, and because I know that it's safe and effective, that therefore I can go compete with you. Because if you've got factories and you're producing this stuff, you have a head start over me. You can sell this stuff, I can't sell this stuff. And that's what's going on in Europe today. They're selling this stuff, but there's not that much to be sold. Okay? So the point of this is what's called a first mover advantage. And what's a first mover advantage? It says if you're first to market, you get a big advantage over the others. You can sell while other people are not there. Not because you have a patent, because you were first. And why is Tesla doing so well? Because it ain't that easy to build an electrical car. You can read all the patents in the world. But if you don't have the practical experience of manufacturing thing in the factories, the learning of how to operate the factories, the sales force, right? The perfected product that actually works as opposed to the product that kind of doesn't quite work yet, right? You can't sell electrical cars. And Tesla has a huge head start over everybody else. And that's why their stock has gone through the roof, even though they're not yet selling that many cars compared to the big manufacturers, because they've got a big, big head start over everybody else when it comes to really selling electrical cars. Okay? And that's the heart of why it is that patents are probably unneeded, and certainly unneeded in their current form, even for pharmaceutical products. Now, that's going to wrap up. Michele and I started working on this, I think it was back in about 1997. I know it was before the Napster affair blew up, which I know was in 1999. And I do have a post of mine dating back to 1997 on this topic of patents, also copyright, which we worked on at the same time. When we started working on this, the prevailing view in the economics profession was encapsulated by the argument that I made at the beginning in favor of patents, and the argument that Elon Musk made in favor of patents and then rejected. And that is that patents are a necessary evil. You need them in order to get innovation. The economics profession as a whole believed that. Michele and I, as individual members of the profession, also believed that. Okay. And oddly enough, in a triumph of theory over empiricism, what opened our eyes was a theory showing that probably wasn't necessarily true as a matter of theory. And that led us to look more carefully at the facts. And the facts convinced us, indeed, it is true that patents are an unnecessary evil. And I will say this, we were very iconoclastic when we started doing this. Okay. And I would say today, however, and this, I hope that the two of us played some role in this, I would say that today the conventional wisdom of the economics profession is different. Not necessarily that patents should be abolished, but I think that the widespread belief, particularly by people who work on patents in economics, is that the current patent system is evil. So there's been a substantial change in the view among economists about the role of patents in innovation and growth and development. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. And so at this point, I'm open to questions and discussion.
Terrific. Well, I'll just quickly remind everyone in the audience that there's a Q&A function at the bottom if they want to send more questions in. But in the meantime, I mean, so much that it's amazing seeing the arguments that I recall you making about the development of the pharmaceutical and the chemical industries in Germany in the 19th century updated, and with COVID being used as a pretty pertinent and visible example of how actually it's the knowledge on manufacturing that's difficult for people to replicate rather than simply copying and pasting an idea that can be patent protected. I was wondering if you'd be willing, for the benefit of people in the audience who've not read your books, just to run over the case study of the development of the chemical industries at the turn of the last century, and how differently things turned out when they developed in patent regime countries compared to non-patent regime countries.
Yeah, well, it turns out that the process of innovation is typically enhanced by people not patenting things so they can make use of other people's ideas and improve them. And this goes back and forth and back and forth. This is the history of the software industry. And in fact, if you look at the history of the software industry, it developed in places where it's easy for people to start new firms without no compete agreements with their old firms to develop new products. And then this fed back to the original. Sometimes these new firms were then bought up by the original firms, which became much more profitable, and the whole industry grew and everybody profited. Now, a classical case study of this, as you indicate, is in the late 19th century, the sort of past mid-19th century, late maybe 1860s, 1870s, is in the development of the chemical industry. This is sometimes considered the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, the development of the chemical industry, commercial chemicals. Commercial chemicals obviously have a lot in common with the production of pharmaceutical products. Many for a long time. Now we have a lot of biopharmaceutical products, but of course for a long time, medicines actually were chemical products, chemical formulas. So let me say a little bit about that, because there were three different regimes. There was the regime in the United Kingdom, which was a strong patent regime. You could patent, a lot of the competition revolved around chemical dyes. You could patent a color. If you had the patent for the color red, then nobody could produce a red dye without your permission, okay? You think I'm making this up, but I'm not. Now, in Switzerland, there was no patents. It was against the Constitution. And it's an interesting fact to me that I don't know how many people know this. Albert Einstein got to start working in the Swiss Patent Office. And it occurs to me, he must be one of the very first employees of the Swiss Patent Office, because he started working there at just about the time where, under pressure from other countries, Switzerland introduced patents for the first time. And prior to Albert Einstein, there was no patent office because there were no patents in Switzerland. Germany had a more mixed system. Germany had a system where there were patents, but they were weak patents. So you couldn't patent a color. You could only patent a particular way of manufacturing a dye. So if somebody came up with a better manufacturing process, that wasn't covered by your patent. So there was the strong patent system in the UK, the weak patent system in Germany, and the non-patent system of Switzerland. So what happened? At the beginning of this period, the UK was clearly the leader in the chemical industry and the chemical dye industry in particular. By the end of this period, there was no, in the United States, by the way, had a similar patent system to that of the UK. There's basically no chemical industry left in the UK or the United States. What happened? The manufacturers all fled to Switzerland or Germany. Why? Because there they could actually, they could actually build new dyes and do stuff, right? In the UK, it was crazy. You couldn't do a new red because the red was already patented by somebody. Same thing in the United States. The chemical industry, this is an interesting story. The chemical industry in the United States had fallen so far by World War I, 1914, 1916 probably we're talking about, that they basically were unable to produce their own chemical dyes. Now, at that time, it was very difficult to import them for Germany since there was a war going on and there was a naval blockade. And the United States was so desperate to import chemical dyes from Germany, it so lost the capability of doing it themselves, that they brought them into the United States by German U-boats. It's a very expensive form of transportation, obviously. okay? But there are dyes imported from Germany to the United States in U-boats because it's the only way they could get it. They couldn't build it themselves. Incidentally, the chemical industry changed after World War I, and the reason for that is because of course, all the German and Swiss manufacturers all patented their stuff in the United States and the UK, since they were allowed to do it. So all of the German patents were nationalized by the United States and the UK at the end of World War I because Germany lost the war. And that marks actually the start of the chemical industry in the UK and the United States, was when they took away all the patents from the Germans and they once again could innovate. So that's in short the story of the chemical industry. It's not a story in which patents play a particularly good role. It is a story in which patents do play a pretty bad role.
That's really interesting. There was a talk, and the U-boat thing, by the way. I'm gonna have to go away and look that up because no offense, what a claim! I've never heard that. It's impossible to believe first hearing.
I'm pretty sure that we have it in our book, in which case there will be a citation indicating where you can read about it. So you can probably find it. If you find the online version, maybe you can search for U-boat and you can find it.
Gosh, I mean, that's amazing. I know from one of the earlier talks that we had in this series of talking about the role of universities in promoting themselves as the idea of innovation centers was something that is linked in the UK historically to around the 1980s as a moment when universities started saying we're going to be the primary research labs. And one of the arguments that you often hear for why patents are needful are linked to the arguments you were making earlier on, that it's because a lot of important research is done by governments inside universities that patents become a way for academics to make sure that they're getting their pennies worth from the companies that then take those ideas and work out how to innovate and develop them. And so I was just very curious to put that in front of you and see where you take it.
So these are often called public-private partnerships, and every university in the world that does any kind of innovation has these days. I should remark that there was no shortage of innovation at universities before public partnerships, and I'll explain how public-private partnerships work, and then you'll understand why this is the case. Here's how it works. The government gives a university money to do some research. Researchers use this money to develop new products. When the new products are developed, they go to the private sector, which takes all the profits. So it's a bit of a weird system, right? The government pays for the research, and the private sector gets the money from the development. Gets the proceeds of this go to the private sector from the government-funded research. I and many other people think this is one of the most incredible scams of all time. A bit of money goes to the universities, which is why universities like it. Obviously, the private partners really like it a lot because they get all this free research and they get to have the patents and make all the money. But it's a little hard to see how the tax-paying public that actually pays for the research, you think that maybe they should have some rights to this, but evidently not.
So is that in that case, the way you describe it, is it almost it's a shadow subsidy to industry? Because one of the questions in my mind has been, why was this big change in the public justification for universities something that happened in the 1980s? And I suppose something that you did see in the UK was increasing involvement in the Eurozone and increasing crackdown on the idea that governments should subsidize industry. What you're describing there is that this model of government subsidy of university passing that on to local industrial partners is almost a backdoor for the national subsidy of many concerns. Is that a fair reading?
There's a little bit more to it than that, because as I said, universities do get money out of this. It may be peanuts compared to what the private sector gets, but it's not peanuts for the universities. And you have to bear in mind the context in which this occurred is also a context in which governments were becoming increasingly concerned about the amount of money that they were spending both on research and development and on universities in general. So shifting some of this, so basically by giving these grants, right, was a way of indirectly subsidizing universities as well as the private sector. So instead of the government paying money out of the tax budget, right, they take the proceeds of this government-funded research and they allow it to be sold, and then the proceeds of that come back to the university, some of it. right?
Gotcha.
So it's attractive. A lot of schemes that we see. So it's hidden subsidies are generally preferred by governments to direct subsidies. So, for example, price supports for agriculture. We see both direct payments to farmers, but we also see price support for agricultural products. And part of and to tell you the truth, between the two of them, by far the better is just to give the farmers the money. From an economic point of view, having price supports is actually a pretty bad subsidy scheme. But the reason that a large part of these subsidies take place through price controls and price laws is because it's much more hidden that way, right? If there's a government budget item that says payment to farmers, somebody that's not a farmer might get mad, and a politician might campaign to get rid of those subsidies. But when it's hidden, it's much less visible to the taxpayer and to voters. And therefore, it's much more politically palatable for governments to operate this way. I think that's much the case with these public-private partnerships. They're not very visible, right? So there's a subsidy involved both in the private sector and universities, right? But that's hidden from the view of the taxpayer. The actual research expenditures are not hidden.
Gotcha. And I guess that maybe brings on to another thought that maybe this gives away my inner sociological biases, but the economist inside me is very willing to believe that the frictions in actually learning how to do something are sufficient that you get away with being the first mover, inventing something, even if you don't have a patent. And so the economic argument for patents is quite weak. There must then be a sociological reason for it, because we have seen patents in the form of royal monopolies and aristocratic monopolies, and today as patents that anybody can buy relatively freely, but then still give them some kind of monopoly. We've seen them through so many different human societies. What are they sociologically for? Are they still useful in creating an atmosphere where innovation? I'd be really curious for your thoughts there.
I'm going to add to your examples the example of software patents, because after all, software development of the software industry was one of the biggest and most important developments starting in the 1950s. And from 1950s, when the software began to be developed, to 2000, you'd have a hard time finding a lot of important developments in software ideas since 2000. Almost all the really big components of software programs were invented before that. And so you ask yourself the question, here is one of the most innovative and thriving industries we've ever seen, in which, because of funny legal rules, it's impossible to patent anything. Why would you then introduce patents into that industry, which is what was done in the late 1990s in the United States? What would be the rationale for that? Was there not enough innovation in the software industry? That seems pretty crazy, right? And there was been one major development in software ideas that I know of since that time, and that was the invention of Bitcoin and the blockchain. Not only was that not patented, the person that invented it, to this very day, we don't know who it is. Right? This is the ultimate opposite of a patent. Not only does the inventor not get a patent, the inventor never even says who they are. Right? Anyway, so what then is the reason for patents? This is actually why I no longer work on intellectual property in my professional life. And involves both patents and copyrights. So we could raise a similar issue with respect to copyrights. So Larry Lessig is a lawyer who has worked quite a bit on intellectual property, mostly on copyright. And he was involved in a number of Supreme Court cases. One of the most famous Supreme Court cases was one that had to do with the extension of the length of copyright in the United States. Now, the way that it works is this: when they extend copyright in the United States, it applies not only to new works that haven't been created yet, it applies to old works that have already been produced. Now, it's very difficult to figure out what the economic rationale is for extending copyright protection to something that's already been around for 40 years, right? So it's one thing to say we need copyright so people have an incentive to build new stuff. But why do we need copyright to convince people to build stuff that they've already built? I mean, it's a borderline insane sort of thing. He went to the Supreme Court to argue the case against the retroactive part of copyright extension. And the Supreme Court of the United States, with its originalist scholars, who believed in the exact meaning of words as they were written down in the Constitution of the United States, concluded that the words "for limited times" meant forever. And he walked away from that and he said, the problem isn't, right? The problem isn't the intellectual battle. The problem is the political battle. The special interests, in this particular case, it was the Disney Corporation. Why the Disney Corporation? Because every copyright extension in the United States has come about when the copyright of Mickey Mouse was about to expire. And every time the copyright of Mickey Mouse was about to expire, Disney Corporation would go to the United States Congress and lobby very heavily to get an extension of copyright, and they were always successful, and they're still successful to this very day. The Mickey Mouse copyright, which is supposed to have expired in about 1960, is still valid now in 2020. Okay, so his question was, why are these special interests so successful in overcoming the general interest? That is, there's no general interest in retroactive copyright extension. The same question, why do we see patents if they're not playing a useful role in innovation? So you can be sure that pharmaceutical companies really like patents. They may not benefit the rest of us, they may not increase innovation, but they certainly increase the bottom line of pharmaceutical companies. And you can be sure whenever there's a patent discussion in a political organization, the Parliament of the UK or the Congress of the United States, you can be sure that the lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry are out in force explaining what a great idea patents are, and on and on and on, and maybe greasing the wheels a little bit at the same time. How do the wheels get greased, by the way? So the greasing of wheels these days is very rarely done by actual money exchanging hands. Larry Lessig was very concerned about political contributions in the United States and now in the UK as well. They're big private contributions to political campaigns, and lobbyists give lots of money to politicians on both sides because they don't really care who wins as long as the politician is beholden to them. But that actually, unfortunately, Larry went to lobby very heavily against political contributions without any success, I should say. But that, unfortunately, is only the tip of the iceberg. So another example would be what really is the real thing. There was one particular senator of the United States Senate, Dobb was his name. I think that was his name. He was called the senator from Hollywood, even though he represented a completely different state, not California at all. And he was called this because he was the water carrier for the movie industry whenever they wanted some sort of concession on copyright from Congress. Now, eventually he retired from the Senate, and he immediately became the CEO of the main film lobbying organization, a multi-million-dollar a year job. So this is a typical way in which lobbyists operate in order to effectively bribe politicians, either through offering jobs to people after they finish their political careers, which is very common, or, for example, by hiring family members, all of which is very difficult to legislate against. Okay, so the reason I got out of this is because I had another question, and my question was this. Sure, these guys effectively are paying off politicians to get what they want. I don't think there's widespread disagreement over this. That's been part of the economics literature and political economy for decades. But here's, to me, the difficult question. Say, oh, these are very rich industries. Hollywood has lots of money. Yeah, the amount of money that Hollywood has compared to not Hollywood is like zero. That is, no particular industry really controls a very large percentage of national income in any country. Moreover, we looked at data on farm subsidies. It turns out the less important are the farmers, the more every person in that country pays in farm subsidies. So there's something about these guys being small that actually works to their advantage. You say, look, everybody who's not Hollywood, they should be able to outbid Hollywood. They have a lot more money than not Hollywood. If we all threw in a dime or a dollar or a pound or something, we could outbid these guys without any trouble. And it happens once in a while. It happens once in a while. There was, at one point, the copyright industry in the United States overreached. They proposed some particularly draconian copyright laws mostly involved piracy over the internet. And this was in the United States. This legislation was sponsored by, I forget, more than a majority of the United States House of Representatives who thought the lock is in. Usually these things actually pass unanimously in the dark of night. What actually happened here was that large companies, not like companies actually, large groups like the Wikimedia Foundation realized that this was a really bad idea, and they organized people, all the other people that aren't Hollywood and aren't the music industry, and all of a sudden congressmen started getting tons of emails and letters from their constituents saying, hey, this is really bad. Jimmy Whale said it's really bad. You better not do this. And you know what? The thing vanished. It got no votes. It just disappeared. So when the bidding really comes down to it, the big groups can outbid the small groups. So the thing that's been a great interest to me, and a lot of my current research's focus, is not on the issue of intellectual property at all, but on the question of why it is that the small lobby group is so effective, okay, and why sometimes they're not so effective. Because it seems to me that the answer to the conundrum over patents and copyrights lies in fixing the political system, right? And I would add to that, I think there's other issues which don't involve patents and copyrights at all. But if you look at populist movements, they're often driven by frustration by voters over the fact that they correctly perceive that there are all these special interests that are taking advantage of them. And there's two ways you can deal with populists. One is by trying to repress them. The other is by trying to get rid of the special interests. So I don't have much doubt about why it's true. I have some doubts about what to do about it.
Gotcha. And so your interpretation is essentially there's not much of an excuse for it. It's just an egregious thing that happens when political elites sometimes take advantage of the societies that they're governing, and that's happening in a democracy in the same way as it used to happen in monarchies back in the old days. I suppose one of the questions that's been flung forward by the audience on a sort of what do we do about it point, it is saying, well, using the example of Switzerland, back in the late 19th century. Is this something that, say, if the UK could move to being a no patent regime, would it then draw in all of these amazing innovative industries and start a spiral effect, forcing other countries to follow it? Or are there reasons why it's so difficult for, in the same way as we have tax havens, us also to have no patent havens seizing those upside rewards from innovation?
It would probably be very difficult for the UK to do that because the UK has a relatively limited domestic market. And of course, the problem is that patents would still exist overseas. So so the problem is, so India, why did India introduce pharmaceutical patents? It was threatened by, why would India, a successful, thriving pharmaceutical industry without pharmaceutical patents, and why did it stop? So it had a thriving, successful industry because India is quite a large country and has a large domestic market. So it could support a large pharmaceutical industry. It could not sell its products outside of India, except maybe in places like Africa, but it couldn't sell its products in Western Europe and the United States because they were violating patents. Now, there's very little pharmaceutical industry in India today compared to what there used to be. And the reason for that is as part of trade agreements with Western countries, they were forced to enforce patents. I would say that at the moment, the place which is most likely to attract innovation, and indeed there's evidence that's doing so, because of not lack of patents, because they certainly exist there, but perhaps lack of enforceability of patents, is China. China has lots of intellectual property laws on the books. It's also notorious for not enforcing them particularly well. And it's an interesting but curious fact, if you were to look at innovation in China versus Europe, continental Europe, not the UK or the United States. In the United States and UK, there's quite a bit of innovation going on. You should talk to people that, for example, are trying to start new firms or get venture capital in Europe to really develop new products and new innovations. If you look at why are all the big internet firms in the United States and also in China, why are self-driving cars being developed in the United States for the most part? Right? If you actually look at innovation, right, you'll find there's government-sponsored innovation, some industries in Europe. I don't want to exaggerate the situation, but the level of innovation in Europe, which is as wealthy and as well-educated as China and the United States, is really quite low compared to China and the United States. And I suspect that a lot is not necessarily because of intellectual property laws per se, but there's a lot of barriers towards innovation in continental Europe. Okay, this is, I think, one of the great flaws of it. I don't think it's a flaw of the EU. It's a widespread consensus among continental European countries that professions and people should be protected from competition. Patents are one form of protection from competition. It's by no means the only form of protection from competition. And in protecting people from competition, you inhibit innovation, because innovation by its nature threatens existing interests. So there's always a tug of war between existing interests who are threatened by innovation and innovators themselves. Now, politically, existing interests have a lot more weight. It's a somewhat unbalanced tug of war because they already have the money, they already have the political influence, right? Whereas the new innovators, who are they, right? And that balance is different in different areas in different countries at different times in different regions. I think it's rather tilted against the innovator in Europe right now. It seemed to be tilting against innovators in the United States and UK, but not as much. Don't know, a lot of political change is taking place in China, and they're interfering a lot with private industry. So that may put a damper on things, but at least until they decided that Jack Ma was no good, there was quite a lot of thriving innovation in China, and people at least thought that they could win the fruits of their innovation, even though there were no patents.
That's fascinating, and the fact that China has been setting that example is quite telling, because I think the question was launched from a position of, why hasn't anyone tried it? And if the answer is yes, China's tried it, that's another interesting data point. I suppose there's another question here from the audience around the impact of patent box laws and tax regimes and what impact they've had on the whole system.
Sorry, patent box laws?
Patent box laws, which I'm understanding to mean, and this is me inferring, so if the questioner wants to clarify that, they're really welcome to.
It would be helpful because I'm not familiar with the term. I thought I knew most of the terminology in this area, but patent box? No, I don't know.
I think it might be referring to the different ideas around buying patents from private companies and putting them centrally under. Right. That's a guess.
Yeah, I am familiar with that. There's actually another word for that that's commonly used, which is eluding me at the moment. But yes, here's a typical. The name has gone out of my head. I'll call it patent box, although I've never heard it called that before. But what large companies do in an industry. So, for example, let's take the software industry. Let's take IBM and Microsoft and Apple. What they do is they form, I know what it's called a patent pool in the terminology I'm familiar with. What they do is they reach an agreement among themselves. They'll patent everything in sight, but they all agree that they can all use each other's patents freely. Okay? So everything's patented, but as far as the members of the industry are concerned, it doesn't matter because they have an agreement that they can just ignore each other's patents. That's called a patent pool in the terminology I'm familiar with. I think that's what's being discussed here.
I think it's possibly just sort of a clarifying message coming in. I think it's more to do with differential tax regimes for patent-based revenues as opposed to normal ones. And so the phrase that's been said, and they say the patent box is designed to encourage companies to keep and commercialize intellectual property in the UK. It allows companies to apply a lower rate of corporate tax to profits earned from patented inventions. Now, and that seems like a pretty obvious, egregious but
I don't much like the idea, but I have to say I'm also quite ignorant about this. So I'm really reluctant to comment on something. When it comes to the tax laws involving patent revenues, I know literally nothing. So I think it would be a mistake for me to comment on that.
No, absolutely.
As described, it doesn't sound to me like a particularly good idea, but without knowing the details or anything about it, what the arguments for it are, I'm really very reluctant to either condemn it or not condemn it, right? I just don't know.
No, quite. Well, in which case, then maybe as the last question for me, just Ren, we've touched on copyright a couple of times, and there's still so much to talk about in that direction, but I can't resist just going back to your comments around patents coming in software in the late 1990s, and then blockchain as being one of the first splits from it. And to some of us, looking at the excitement of people who are much more at the cutting edge of software development than we are, the excitement for building things around blockchain sometimes seems a bit strange, because blockchain, as a speaker earlier today described, is really just a list that's difficult to change. Do you think that the blockchain ecosystem, one of its big draws that people aren't talking about, is that there's a lot more patent-free innovation that's being allowed there? That ideas that would have been advanced in centralized software over the last 20 years are now being experimented with and advanced inside blockchain land? Or do you think that that's pretty naive, and that you're going to see the same patent restrictions that hurt the development of better software after 2000 quite quickly come in and hurt developments in the blockchain arena?
I should clarify, I actually don't think that the lack of software development since 2000 has much to do with patents one way or the other. I think it had to do with the fact that there were a lot of big ideas out there and they were mostly used up by 2000. So we see a life cycle of industry, and the life cycle of industry is actually very rarely includes patents at the beginning, but there's low-lying fruit, there's big ideas to be picked, and people do that, and they become successful and they compete like crazy, and there's hundreds of companies, and then there's what's called the shakeout, and guys buy up and there's just a few companies left. At that point, they suddenly want patents to keep other people out. So that's kind of what happened in the software industry. And if you actually look at how patents have been, so one thing about patents, of course, they do exclude, this is what I was getting to with patent, was they do exclude outsiders. So obviously the big guys all have a patent pool. So patents aren't inhibiting their innovation at all. They can do whatever they want because they have access to everybody's patents anyway. It's a little bit harder for somebody to break into the industry, but as far as I can tell, and people I know who are expert lawyers in this say that this is true, they pretty much ignore patents anyway. There's not much evidence that patents are actually keeping people from innovating. The primary use of patents in most of the patent lawsuits over software have been used for a completely different purpose. They've been used to protect a model of selling printers at a very low price and selling ink cartridges at a very high price. And how does that work? Because the ink cartridges have patented software inside of them, and therefore you can't sell an ink cartridge in competition with me, Hewlett Packard, because I have a patent on the ink cartridge.
Right.
And therefore I can sell my printer below cost. So what would happen if they got rid of patents there? They'd have to sell printers more expensive and charge less for the ink cartridges. Doesn't seem like a huge social tragedy to me, but there I think you have the biggest impact that we've seen of software patents. So no, I think that my answer is I think that there are relatively few big ideas left, and the reason for there's a lot of development around blockchain is it was a really good idea in an environment where not so many big ideas were coming along anymore.
Right, gotcha. Super. Well, look, I'm aware of time, and I want to thank you again for just taking an hour out on a Saturday to talk to us. I found that phenomenally interesting, and yeah, I'm terribly grateful for you to come along. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it, and thank you to you and the audience. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thanks, everybody.